when I finished my first book, I had like, I think 2 or 3 pages in the end where I wrote a little bit why relationship matters and why I feel so passionate about it. And so some people then complained and said, well, your book was okay, but then at the very end it got really interesting and then the book stopped. Right? You stopped with the big picture. And so I wanted to share with you 6 different reasons why I think relationships are so important for the future of humanity and for creating a better world, including procreation for those who can and want to have children. And this whole thing started for me in 2001, right after 9/11. I started to go for the Center for Spiritual Living in Santa Rosa. And as I had shared a few times before, I grew up in Germany, and my parents were happily married for 50 years until my dad passed away in 2006. And my mom is still alive, and I talk to her every week, and not a call goes by where she doesn't still express her gratitude and how lucky she was. And and so I grew up in a world where people, at least from my perspective, were all happily married and had children. And so for the first time in my life, I heard of people who almost talked about relationships as a pathology, right? They said, oh, what's not whole and complete in you that you want to be in a relationship? If you're really spiritual, then you don't need anyone, and you become, be on this path towards wholeness, and having children, that was something like, really bad for the planet, and it was really, really strange to me. And so for several years, I, kind of tried to convince people, probably often not in a very helpful way, to convince them that there are quite a few personal benefits of being in relationship. And then once Marlena Lyons and Chet Psarsis came to the Integral Center there and gave a talk, and they, about undefended love, and they said, well, people get together basically for 3 reasons. And their time, right? People don't want to be alone because we're social animals, and there are certain hormones that are released in healthy relationships that heighten our well-being and our immune system and things like that, and lower inflammation. So I have an end note here about that. And the other one, good reason to be together, is to share resources. It's just like couples, we know, are financially usually better off, and you consume less resources. And so the whole monetary material aspect about being in relationship. And then last but not least, the sex part. Now, sex is not only fun, but it also has tremendous health benefits if we have a satisfying and healthy sex life. And then they said, and now we're going to tell you the 3 big reasons why couples break up. And everybody got like, oh yeah, that's important, we want to hear that one. And of course it turned out to be the same: time, money, and sex. And I have a little link here to an article that the thing that people fight most about when they separate, maybe even before the children, is the money. And I've been lucky that I didn't have these fights in my 2 divorces, but that seems to be the exception. And so for a long time, I argued, and I started Singles to Couples, that people would want to be in relationship to have all these benefits. But a lot of people said, well, I don't feel alone. I have enough friends, and I'm actually happy to live alone or have my 2 dogs and my cat and maybe a housemate or something. So that wasn't convincing to people. And most people in Northern California, they have enough money, so that's not a driving motivator for them to share resources. And also a lot of people say, well, I don't need to be in a relationship to have sex. There's enough workshops and enough friends and enough polyamorous group and a lot of sleeping around. So that's not convincing. And so I was kind of thinking, well, there must be some other reasons why healthy relationships matter. And so I want to share 6 of them to you that I came up with. And the first one is that maybe it doesn't matter to you, right, if you're single, and I'm not speaking so directly to you, but more in general probably, that if we don't open up and develop the capacity to be in a relationship and see the value in relationship for ourselves, it matters to the other person who would potentially love to be in relationship with us. Right? We're in this me generation, and I admit sometimes I also think more about, what would I get out of a partnership and what is important to me. And, sometimes I think, well, there might be a woman out there who could really also benefit from being in relationship with me. And of course, there needs to be a shared purpose and a mutuality. But, if half of the population decides they do not want to be in a relationship, I mean, mathematically that's not right, but theoretically we're depriving the other half of the population of being in a relationship. I know the other 50% could still be in relationship, and that's actually the case. But sometimes I tell my clients, this is not all about you. This is also about a potential partner who could benefit from being in relationship with you. And somebody posted this poem from Rumi: your task is not to seek for love, to remove all barriers that prevent it. And then I have here endnotes, if you're interested, about all the benefits of being in a relationship. And again, don't only think about you, but think about another person who may be deprived of these benefits because not more people are open to be in a relationship. My second reason, I call it here spiritual soul level, but I probably should rename that in an evolutionary way of thinking, that we are here today, right now, because of 3.5 billion years of biological passing on of genetic material. And then about 1 billion years, I think, procreation started, where organisms started to combine their genetic material. And through that long process, including all our human ancestors and of course your parents, your grandparents, and your particular ancestors of your family tree, they all procreated, and so assuming you are procreating or you procreated, you are basically a chain in the link between the past, the genetic past, and the genetic future. And if we go beyond our ego and really get in touch with our soul's purpose and get in touch with our biological purpose and our transformational and transcendental purpose, we not only pass on our genes, and we do that independently of passing on our genes, we're also a link, as we saw in the movie Cloud Atlas, that our actions now matter in some way for future generations. And as I hopefully argued sufficiently, we become fully human in the context of relationships and really can create a world that is more equal between males and females and the feminine and masculine, and pass on what we learn and manifest in our relationships to future generations by modeling that and by creating more goodness, truth, beauty, and functioning in the world, or functionality. And so it really matters for future generations that as many people as possible co-create and procreate. A third reason is that it matters for functioning societies. And here I'm drawing mainly from Jürgen Habermas, which some of you are probably familiar with, iconic German social and critical philosopher, now in his 90s, I think, and Ken Wilber drew a lot from his philosophy. And then there is a lesser known German philosopher who I became good friends with, Professor Dr. Ferdinand Fellman, and he wrote a book which is also available in English called The Couple, very interesting. And here's another one of these Martin graphics that I want to explain briefly to you, where if we start here at the bottom, humans obviously emerged 100,000 or maybe 1 million years ago. The time seems to go further and further back, where we find early fossil records of early humans emerged out of the natural world, where pretty much all other animals live what Fellman called side by side in herds or flocks or pods or whatever. We have different words for the groups of animals, like envision the penguins and the geese and the apes and so on and so forth. And then at some point, humans became self-conscious, and probably our sexuality, as we saw a little bit in the movie The Search for Fire, became self-conscious and created deeper bonds and living more with each other than just next to each other. And then out of these bonds, eventually formed families and tribes and communities. Again, we saw that in this movie. And then when city-states formed and agriculture was invented and humans settled down and the population grew, then slowly systems of money and power emerged. Right? And we got all the Greek city-states and all the human history. And they were initially very much in service of the individuals who created them to coordinate the life world, as Jürgen Habermas calls it, of these families and tribes and communities. And then what happened over the last few hundred years specifically is that these systems of power and money became more and more powerful and overarching, and there's this word encroachment. They encroached on the individual and their freedoms and their liberation. And so we don't need to go into the whole discussion right now with COVID and everything else. But still, if we are living in a family and in a community, the community provides a buffer so that the system is not directly encroaching on the individual, and the individual doesn't become so totally dependent on the system. But when we have too many singles, then of course this buffer deteriorates and goes away, and then there's this dotted line here where the individual, male and female, single, becomes more and more dependent on the system, and the system gets more and more power over the individuals. And so Habermas wrote many years ago, and it sounds, more current than ever, that out of this encroachment and this disappearance and displacement of the life world, so he calls this middle part here in the widest sense the life world, we see a decrease in shared meaning and mutual understandings, an erosion of social bonds, a disintegration of communities, an increase in people's feelings of helplessness and lack of belonging, the consequent unwillingness of people to take responsibility for their actions and for social phenomenon, and the destabilization and breakdown of social order and stability. So I think, this is not a given destiny, but I think I deeply, deeply believe, and what deeply, deeply motivates me is that we need to come back to forming different and more stable kinds of relationships between any kind of partners of any sexual orientation, of course, so that we get back to a more stable life world, and that the system does not encroach on the liberation of individuals and, of course, of communities, that we can push back on a local level and on a family level, etc., against this encroachment of the system. And here is a little bit more description, and then this wonderful little book, Habermas, a very short introduction by Gordon Finlayson, which I recommend everyone to buy if you're interested in social phenomenon and critical philosophy. Then on a demographic level, it matters for older people, and I'm concerned about this for the last 20 years when I got to know so many people who said they didn't want to have children, and I say it very brutally. My thought was always, who's going to wipe your ass when you're old, right? If let's say nobody has children any longer, or we have very, very few children, then who will take care of the elderly? And I know that this is somewhat of a German perspective because we have a word called Generationenvertrag, which means generational contract, which implies it's not a law, but it's like a cultural implicit thing for Germans of my age, that we assumed, right, that we would take care of our parents and grandparents to the extent we can. And my mother lives, or my brother now lives with my mother, with his wife and his kids, and takes care of her. And she took care of her parents, and my father's parents, they took together care of them. And then, we would in a way expect that our children, to the extent that they can and want, would take care of us. And so it's strange to me now, and now of course it's all over the newspapers recently with the new US Census, that we get these overaging societies where you see a few examples here of China, for example, right, 1990, 2014, 2025, and 2050. I just read that the Chinese population, if it continues on the current trajectory, will shrink from the 1.1 billion to 600 million by 2020, by 2100, so in 80 years. And so many other societies will more or less cut in half of their population unless there is major immigration, which has all its own problems as well. So here we see these population trees that used to look like Christmas trees, and now they're in many countries looking increasingly like kites. Here for Germany, for example, 1910, 2005, and 2025. So that's true for pretty much all countries except for some African nations, and there it's just delayed. So eventually they're also moving towards shrinking populations in the next few decades. So it matters there. My greatest concern is this one. And I think there is some hope on some other level, but at least we need to realize, and I really think we need to do this, is that until about 100 years and mainly until about 50 years when the pill was invented and so became socially accepted, and other forms of contraception, and specifically women on a large scale getting educated, which is a wonderful and great thing, and enter the workforce if they want to. Some women feel they have to enter the workforce, and had contraception available and became empowered, and sometimes also not finding good men that they want to marry and having children with. So there's a platitude of reasons that in the last 50 years we can say that fertility rates among people at orange and higher levels have really dropped, and the more evolved and conscious and liberated and independent women become and educated, the less they procreate, while women at earlier levels of consciousness, mythic and below, are still procreating, not at the high rates that they used to, but still at considerably higher rates than people at higher levels of consciousness. And so in the first time of human history, and some people still unfortunately don't want to see that, is that the center of gravity where most people were in a society kept moving from the left to the right, because the children of the people at higher levels of consciousness had a higher chance of survival, and people grew older, they had longer time to have children themselves, and so they basically were the leading edge and moving cultural and social evolution forward. And now we see for the first time in more and more countries this regression of this center of gravity here, which leads to the autocratic governments and to, we just had some Supreme Court decisions from a conservative Supreme Court in America, etc., and we can just look around the world into certain societies where we will probably see that pan out, from Afghanistan to Israel to Poland to maybe the United States. and more countries, having these more conservative leaning and eventually anti-democratic leaning governments, or at least movements. And so even if we develop wonderful technology up here, and ideas and values, and if they're not accepted by a majority of the people, it's very unlikely that they then will become part of the socio-political system. So that is my greatest concern, which we will see in a funny but also painful way on Tuesday when we watch the movie Idiocracy, which you may have seen before, which was made in 1995, so 26 years ago. And this is just happening more and more. What was displayed in that movie is kind of like a comedy. So that's my major concern. And then finally, we never really talked about holonic structures, and this is just showing a little bit a problem from a more philosophical standpoint. Is that very briefly, I don't want to bore you too long with this, is that our bodies are obviously made up of subatomic particles out of stardust, some people say, that form atoms, and then they form molecules, and molecules form cells, and then tissues, and then organs, and then humans. And in integral philosophy, Ken Wilber, he didn't coin that term, but we call that as individual holon. And then from there, even though Wilber is adamant that we shouldn't do that, but I'm doing it anyway because I think it's right, essentially, we have what's called social holons, and they have different qualities. They don't have a dominant monad, and there is good reasons why we should qualify what we're doing here. But generally, individual humans traditionally form couples, and couples form families, families form communities, communities form societies, and then the total of societies creates humanity. And of course, atoms or subatomic particles are the smallest, and all of humanity is the biggest. And then, of course, the whole world and the whole universe, which has continued to increase in size here, even though that's not a social holon in that sense. And then ideally, in individual holons, we always have this span, right, that we have more atoms than molecules, and less or fewer cells and fewer tissue and fewer organs, and then one human being here at the top. And what we value the most increases the lesser the smaller the span, the greater the depth, right? So if you poop out a few cells when you go to the bathroom or lose them otherwise, that's not a big deal. You don't even notice. And maybe even if you lose some cell tissue, that's not a big deal. But if you lose an organ, you give that much more depth. And of course, you as the total human being has more depth, more value, if you will, than the parts that you're made out of, so to speak. And then traditionally, we used to give the couple the highest value over the individual. That may sound strange to modern people, but the reason why we're here is because humanity and religions and tribes always valued the co-creative and procreative couple the highest, right? The individuals, they were more disposable, but and then the depth was decreasing in the family, in the community, in the society. In other words, the bonding, how much we care about others, decreases when we go up in this social holonic structure. And then what happened in modernity, here is a brief description how on individual holons the lower levels are absolutely instrumental and fundamental, and in the social holons the lower levels are instrumental, fundamental, but not totally necessary. So what we see now, and again, that's the concern of Habermas and Fellman, and I adopted that from them, if you will, that now that we give the greatest value to the individual, we have fewer couples, fewer families, and we have this breakdown of communities, while the size of the societies also now starts to shrink in some countries, but it's still basically the same, even though the growth is coming to a grinding halt. And so there is this danger that the system here, and that that this load of more old people, more single people will kind of come crashing down on us. And so that's why, again, I think why healthy couple relationships, just even our capacity to get along with one person. I often said, how can we expect to create a peaceful world and get along with people if we cannot even get along with one person? Right? So, and really share resources and practice, so like having a relationship in all four quadrants, a healthy relationship and a peaceful relationship. If we unlearn that and don't manage that, then I'm skeptical. I'm not pessimistic, but I'm skeptical, and that's why I feel so driven every morning to get out of bed and push these ideas forward as good as I can, even though they're a little challenging for some people to grasp, but I think it's pretty clear. And so here are two quick links. The couple from Ferdinand Fellman, and a link to all the images in Sex, Purpose, Love, where I have all the statistics, because some people have all kinds of arguments around specifically the birth rates, but there are many statistics available where you see the correlation between income, education, religion, and political orientation, and the number of children that people have with different value systems and different levels of income and education. And there you see, in the aggregate, you see that that's tied to consciousness development. And then there's a book called The Exceptional 7%, 9 Secrets of the World's Happiest Couples. That's also a book I enjoyed reading. So that's hopefully not too depressing at the end of our training. And I just say that the hope that I have is people like you, right? And there are of course, many other teachers in the world, fortunately, who want to support singles and couples, and maybe you are one of them, or you may become one of them, who support singles and couples in co-creating healthy relationships, and to the point that they make a choice themselves to raise conscious children, right? We don't want to force that onto people, but the children are our future. Whitney Houston was right about that in her song. I believe the children are the future, right? A great song about that. And also that I think one important insight that I wish more integral people would adopt is that this idea that we need these higher levels of consciousness development to save the world is not necessarily completely true. It's also important that people at all levels of consciousness create more goodness, truth, beauty, and functionality, and everyone at any level of consciousness has the capacity to do that. Sometimes we're sort of like made to believe that the good people are all at higher levels of consciousness development, but it's absolutely not true. Historically, we've seen that people at all levels of consciousness development provide more goodness, truth, beauty, and functionality. And I think that's a better model for the future of humanity than essentially these models where we hope everybody gets into the integral and transpersonal and higher levels of consciousness. So that's where the hope is from me, and why I feel so passionate about the purpose modules, right? Because I never said you can only identify your purpose at a higher level of consciousness or spiritual development. You can get in touch and live your purpose at any level of development.